Welcome back to the channel. Today, we will temporarily set aside the silicon chips, satellite guidance systems, and stealth coatings that define modern warfare. I want you to close your eyes and imagine a completely different era, an era in which military dominance was not measured in nanoseconds or pixels, but in the suffocating weight of solid steel. We are taking our minds back to a time when engineers challenged every rule of logic and physics to build machines so massive that they didn't just dominate the battlefield. They permanently altered the geography of the places they passed through. This was the age of the superguns. In today's modern world, we are accustomed to surgical precision. A drone can slip through a specific window on the other side of the globe. But in the first half of the 20th century, before missile technology took over, the philosophy of warfare was entirely different. It was the philosophy of brute force. It was an age of industrial arrogance where nations believed that if you built something big enough, loud enough, and heavy enough, you could subdue the enemy through fear alone. We are talking about guns that were not merely weapons, but moving cathedrals of destruction. The sound of these machines firing was not just noise, it was a shockwave, capable of shattering windows miles away, rupturing the eardrums of their own crews and signaling the apocalypse to anyone on the receiving end of the barrel. Yet, there is a reason you no longer see these sea monsters today. Like the biological dinosaurs of prehistory, these steel beasts were apex predators of their age. They were majestic, terrifying, and possessed undeniable power. But they were also slow, monstrously resource-hungry, and carried within them the sentence of extinction as the nature of warfare changed. They represented a brief but mesmerizing moment in history, when metallurgical engineering far outpaced mobility. To operate even one of these guns often required manpower equal to the population of a small town. Thousands of soldiers dedicated rail networks and logistics so complex they often crippled the very armies they served. They were the ultimate expression of the bigger is better mindset, a hypothesis tested in blood and steel during the two largest conflicts in human history. In this episode, we will explore the technical triumphs and strategic failures of the six largest and most ambitious self-propelled and railway guns ever built by humankind. We will see the mechanisms behind how to move a steel building across muddy terrain. We will analyze the ballistics of projectiles as heavy as a school bus, and we will uncover the stories of the men who served these monsters, men who often had to sacrifice their hearing and health to keep the gears turning. From the waterlogged forests of France to the besieged cities of the Eastern Front, these were the machines that tried to conquer the world with sheer kinetic energy. So strap in and prepare for a journey into the heavy metal past. We will count down the top 6 giants of artillery, analyzing not only their firepower, but the fatal flaws that led to their disappearance. Stay with me until the very end, because the machine in the number 1 position is such an absurd, colossal, catastrophic marvel of engineering that it defies belief even by today's standards. This is the story of the rise and fall of the steel dinosaurs. Let the countdown begin. Standing in 6th place in our list of steel dinosaurs is a machine representing the first evolutionary leap in this chronology. If we compare these weapons to prehistoric animals, this is the sauropod, the long-necked giant designed not for close combat, but to reach across seemingly impossible distances. This was the Paris gun. While the higher-ranked weapons on this list focused on brute impact, the Paris gun was obsessed with range. Built by German engineers in 1918 near the desperate end of World War I, it was a weapon born from a specific strategic need: to strike at the heart of the enemy's capital without having to punch through their trench lines. To achieve this, the Germans did not simply build a gun. They constructed a scientific device that accidentally opened the door to the space age. The engineering required to make this machine function was mind-bending. The barrel alone was an architectural colossus over 34 meters long, so long and slender relative to its own weight that it could not support itself. Like a suspension bridge, the barrel had to be held straight by a complex system of tension cables to prevent it from sagging under its own gravity. Seen from a distance, it resembled a massive crane, or a metal spine pointed aggressively at the sky. But the true miracle lay not in the steel, but in the trajectory. Before the Paris gun, artillery was a two-dimensional game. You fired, and the shell traveled through the thick lower atmosphere. Engineers at Krupp realized that to hit Paris from 130 kilometers away, they could not fight the air, they had to escape it. When the Paris gun fired, the shell was launched at such terrifying velocity that it punched through the dense atmospheric layer and entered the stratosphere, reaching an altitude of 40 kilometers. For the first time in human history, an artificial object touched the edge of space. Up there, the air was so thin it was practically non-existent, meaning drag was almost completely eliminated. The shell glided through an almost vacuum-like environment before gravity pulled it back down toward Paris. However, firing at such extreme distance introduced a new variable no artillery crew had ever had to consider before the rotation of the Earth. The flight time, nearly 3 minutes, was long enough for the city of Paris to literally move underneath while the shell was still in the air. This was the first time the Coriolis effect had to be included in ballistic calculations. Mathematicians had to calculate the rotation of the planet itself to ensure the shell wouldn't fall miles off target. Yet, like every dinosaur on this list, the Paris gun had a fatal biological flaw. It was too powerful for its own body. The ferocity of the blast required to send a shell into the stratosphere was so intense that it destroyed the interior of the barrel after every shot. The extreme heat and friction melted the rifling, widening the barrel a little each time it fired, creating a logistical nightmare. Every shell had to be manufactured in a strictly numbered sequence from 1 to 65. Shell number 1 was the smallest, shell number 2 was slightly wider, and so on until shell 65. If the crew accidentally loaded shell 20 before shell 10, the projectile would jam in the barrel, causing the entire gun to explode and killing everyone nearby. After 65 shots, the massive barrel was essentially scrap and had to be shipped back to Germany to be remachined from scratch. In the end, the Paris gun was more a weapon of psychological terror than tactical effectiveness. The people of Paris were completely baffled. They were being bombed, but there were no airplanes in the sky and no distant artillery booms to warn them. Only silent death falling from the stratosphere. It terrified civilians, but did nothing to change the course of the war. It was a technological marvel, but a strategic dead end. It showed that humankind could reach the stars using steel and gunpowder, but it also proved that extreme range came at the cost of extreme fragility. The Paris gun was a glimpse of the missile future, trapped inside the outdated body of a cannon, a long-necked dinosaur stretching toward space before meeting its inevitable extinction. In fifth place, we shift our attention from the graceful reach of the sauropod to the bone-crushing jaws of the Tyrannosaurus rex. If the Paris gun was a long-range needle, then Big Bertha was the sledgehammer brought down directly on the enemy. This weapon, officially designated Device M, but known as Big Bertha, marked a pivotal moment in military history, the realization that no amount of concrete could resist modern industrial force. Before 1914, military strategists believed in the invincibility of fortresses. Europe had poured millions of tons of concrete into gigantic underground bunkers, believing these static structures could stop any invasion. Big Bertha existed to prove them wrong. Weighing 47 tons, this siege howitzer was a true monster. It didn't care about elevation, it only obeyed gravity. Its 420mm barrel fired a shell nearly a ton in weight, launching it high, so it would fall almost vertically onto the target. This was pure destructive physics. The shell fell from above, punched deep into earth and concrete before detonating. It was designed to crack bunkers the way a spoon cracks an eggshell. Its destructive power was so great that the Liège forts of Belgium, believed capable of resisting for months, were reduced to rubble by the Germans in days. But operating this T-Rex was extremely dangerous. The ferocity of Big Bertha's recoil created severe medical risks, with shockwaves strong enough to cause internal bleeding. Artillery crews had to follow bizarre safety rituals, stuffing cotton in their ears, opening their mouths wide to equalize pressure, and standing hundreds of meters away during firing. Forget to open your mouth, and the sudden pressure change could rupture your eardrums instantly. The ground shook like an earthquake, turning the surroundings into impassable mud. To transport the 47-ton machine, the Germans had to disassemble it into 5 sections pulled by steam tractors that looked like supercharged farm equipment. Assembly required over 200 men working for an entire day. It was slow, cumbersome, and vulnerable during deployment, but the psychological impact was immediate. Many Belgian garrisons surrendered, not because their walls were broken, but because they saw Big Bertha being assembled on the horizon. They understood that when the gun roared, physics itself would not be on their side. Big Bertha's legacy was the end of static fortifications. It proved that hiding behind thick walls was no longer a viable strategy in the face of modern metallurgy. It was the machine that turned the safest places into tombs. However, Big Bertha's reign was short. As the war devolved into trench stalemate, its mere 10-kilometer range made it easy prey for Allied long-range counter-battery fire. The T-Rex was king of the forest, but powerless against predators beyond its reach. Yet, in the terrifying moment that was 1914, it was the unquestioned god of war, a steel dinosaur crushing the old order. In fourth place, we encounter a harsh reality of evolution. Not every mutation succeeds. In biology, when a species develops traits too extreme, it often reaches a dead end. The same is true of steel dinosaurs. Enter the French Schneider, 520mm railway howitzer, a machine born not just from strategic need, but from envy. Witnessing the devastating success of German heavy artillery, the French army decided they needed a giant of their own, something that could stare down the German monsters without flinching. They launched an emergency program to build a weapon with a 520mm caliber, meaning the barrel's diameter was over half a meter. It was designed to fire a shell weighing over 1,600 kilograms, packed with enough explosives to vaporize an entire neighborhood. However, the French approach to building this beast exposed the terrifying risks of pushing 1916 metallurgy to its breaking point. Unlike German guns, which use complex hydraulic recoil systems to absorb the massive kick, the French 520mm relied on a system called glissement, or sliding. The gun had no internal recoil mechanism. Instead, the entire 263-ton rail carriage was designed to slide backward along the tracks under the force of the blast. To stop it, giant steel beams were clamped to the tracks to create friction. Imagine the brutality of that physics equation. The only thing preventing a 263-ton building from flying off the rails was steel grinding against steel. It was a crude, savage solution that subjected the entire machine's frame to catastrophic stress with every shot. The mutation's tragedy occurred on July 27, 1918, at the Saint-Pierre-Quiberon test range. The first of the two giants was undergoing test firing. The crew loaded the shell, calculated the shot, and fired. But the projectile never left the barrel. Due to a faulty fuse, or perhaps the overwhelming shock at launch, the shell detonated prematurely while still inside. The result was not an artillery shot, but an internal explosion. The massive barrel, forged to withstand extreme pressure from one direction, peeled open like a banana. The blast obliterated the machine and killed the crew instantly. It was a brutal reminder that in the world of heavy artillery, you are essentially riding a controlled bomb. If that control slips for even a millisecond, the hunter becomes the hunted. The irony of the French 520mm lies in the fact that it served the enemy better than its creators. The second unit, which survived testing, never fired a shot for France in World War I. Instead, it was stored away, a hibernating monster waiting for a conflict worthy of its size. When World War II erupted, the invading Germans captured it. Impressed by the audacity of its design, they put it into service for themselves, turning France's weapon against Leningrad. The dinosaur built to destroy Germans ended its life destroying Russians under a German flag, before its own captured crew destroyed it to prevent recapture. The story of the French 520mm is a cautionary tale of engineering arrogance. It represents the failed mutation on our list. It proves that simply making a gun bigger does not make it better. It makes it more unstable. It shows there is a physical limit to how much energy you can store in a steel tube before the laws of physics demand a blood sacrifice. This machine was not defeated by enemy armor or counterfire. It was defeated by its own internal instability, a dinosaur that grew too large for its own heart to sustain. In third place, the evolutionary timeline takes a terrifying turn. Until now, every monster we discussed shared one fatal weakness. They were slaves to the railway. The Paris gun, big, barely. The French 520mm all could travel only where rails led. If the enemy blew a bridge or sabotaged the tracks, these giants became useless steel statues. But in 1940, German engineering attempted to solve this problem. They asked a question that should haunt anyone's nightmares. What if the fortress destroyer didn't need a train? What if the monster could walk? The answer was the Karl Gerät, a self-propelled siege mortar representing the amphibious stage of dinosaur evolution the moment the beast crawled out of the logistical ocean and onto the dry land of the battlefield. The Karl Gerät was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Though it vaguely resembled a tank, calling it a tank is like calling Godzilla a lizard. It was a massive, hulking block of machinery weighing 124 tons. Equipped with a short 600mm mortar barrel so wide that a grown man could comfortably climb inside. To move this metal mountain, engineers installed a massive Daimler-Benz V12 engine, a mechanical masterpiece derived from maritime engine technology. Yet the laws of weight were so brutal that even with 580 horsepower roaring at full output, the Karl Gerät could only reach a top speed of about 10 kilometers per hour. It didn't drive, it crawled. It was a slow, merciless force of nature announcing its arrival with an engine roar, audible miles away before the first shell was even loaded. However, the true genius and madness of the Carl Garret lay in its suspension system. This was its evolutionary hallmark, because the recoil from a 600mm mortar firing a 2.5-ton shell was so violent, it would snap axles and crush the suspension of any normal vehicle. So German engineers designed the machine to transform. Upon reaching firing position, the entire chassis lowered itself using hydraulics, until the belly of the beast rested flat against the ground. It literally sat down, dispersing recoil directly into the earth, turning the planet itself into its shock absorber. After firing, the hydraulics screamed again, lifting the hull back onto its tracks, and the monster crawled toward its next victim. Its combat debut introduced a new level of horror to urban warfare. We saw this most clearly during the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. The Carl Garret didn't simply punch holes through walls, it erased existence. Its concrete-piercing shells were designed with delayed fuses. They wouldn't explode on impact. Instead, they smashed through the roofs of multi-story apartment buildings, destroyed the 5th floor, the 4th floor. The 3rd floor tore straight into the basement and only then detonated. The result was entire buildings collapsing straight down onto their foundations, burying everyone inside beneath a tomb of rubble. It was a weapon designed not to fight armies but to annihilate cities. Only 7 of these machines were ever built, and in a flourish worthy of Wagnerian drama, the Germans named them after Norse gods Thor, Odin, Loki, Zeus, an attempt to grant divine power to mechanical atrocities. But despite their terrifying reputation, the Carl Garret was ultimately a strategic failure. It was a logistical nightmare, consuming fuel at astronomical rates and required a convoy of support vehicles, including cranes, just to load its ammunition. It was an evolutionary dead end, a creature that had grown legs but was too heavy to run. When the skies filled with Allied bombers, these slow gods became easy targets, proving once again that in the modern age, mobility without speed is just a poetic way of waiting to die. We have reached the summit. In the top positions, both number 2 and number 1, we find the twin kings of the artillery Cretaceous. These were the machines that defined the absolute limit of what could physically be done with steel and gunpowder. They were the Schwerer, Gustav, and its sister Dora. If the other weapons on this list were dinosaurs, these two were Titans, creatures so fearsome that even dinosaurs would tremble. Built by Krupp in the early 1940s, the 800mm railway guns were Adolf Hitler's personal vision of a siege weapon capable of crushing any obstacle on Earth. But in reality, they became the greatest monuments to inefficiency and arrogance of the Nazi war machine. Let's begin with the second place machine. Dora, the perfect embodiment of a logistical nightmare. To understand the absurdity of this weapon, you must look away from the barrel and look at the ground. Dora weighed 1,350 tons. It was so heavy it could not move on standard railway tracks. The weight would grind steel rails into powder and crush wooden sleepers into splinters. To move it, German engineers had to lay a special double-track system, 2 parallel rail lines running side by side, just to distribute the load. Fully assembled, the gun stood as tall as a 4-story building. It wasn't a vehicle, it was a mobile industrial complex. The personnel required to operate Dora was a number that sounds like a typing error. It didn't require a 10-man crew or even a 100-man crew. It required a small army of nearly 4,000 men to fire a single gun. This included artillerymen, 2 anti-aircraft battalions for protection, intelligence officers for target calculations, cooks to feed the small army, and a railway corps constantly building and repairing tracks ahead of it. It was a parasitic organism consuming coal, steel, and manpower on a scale that actively harmed Germany's war effort. It was the ultimate white elephant, a weapon so precious and complex that one hesitated to risk using it. But when its twin sibling, Schwerer Gustav, the number 1 machine, finally entered combat, the results defied belief. Deployed during the siege of Sevastopol in Crimea. In 1942, Gustav proved that despite the logistical insanity, the physics of destruction were horrifyingly real. Gustav did not fire ordinary shells. It fired 2 types: 5-ton high-explosive shells that flattened infantry positions and 7-ton concrete-piercing shells designed to destroy underground fortifications. To put this into perspective, a single shell fired by Gustav weighed as much as 7 family cars welded together, or more than 2 full-grown African elephants. The most legendary shot in the history of artillery occurred when Gustav targeted a Soviet ammunition depot known as the White Cliff. This depot was not a building. It was an underground fortress buried 30 meters beneath the solid rock of Severnia Bay, protected by multiple layers of reinforced concrete. It was considered capable of withstanding nuclear weapons before nuclear weapons existed. Gustav's crew loaded a 7-ton penetrator round, elevated the barrel, and fired. The projectile screamed through the sky, slammed into the bay, drilled through 30 meters of seabed and solid rock like a hot needle through wax, and detonated inside the depot. The resulting explosion was so massive it registered as a local earthquake. It vaporized an entire underwater mountain along with the munitions stored inside. Yet despite this godlike power, Gustav and Dora met tragic ends. They were the last of their species. They emerged at the precise historical moment when air power was rendering static defenses obsolete. A single pilot in a cheap fighter bomber could destroy a 1,350-ton masterpiece with a well-placed bomb. They were too big to hide, too slow to escape, and too costly to lose. In the end, they were not killed by the enemy in glorious combat. As the war turned against Germany, the very engineers who built them were forced to blow them up to prevent their capture. The steel dinosaurs did not go out with a victorious roar, but with a self-inflicted whimper, leaving behind nothing but twisted metal. And a lesson for future generations in the evolution of war: flexibility always defeats size. And so we stand at the end of the timeline, looking back at the fossilized remains of an era that will likely never return. You may wonder, why don't we build machines like the Schwerer Gustav or the Paris gun anymore? The answer lies in the meteor that struck the military world in the mid-20th century. That meteor was air power and guided missiles. The extinction of the steel dinosaurs was not due to a lack of ambition. It was caused by a fundamental shift in the mathematics of war. Strategists realized that a single pilot in a relatively cheap bomber could carry as much explosive as a Gustav shell, yet with infinite flexibility and range. Why spend years and millions of Reichsmarks building a railway gun that took weeks to set up, when a squadron of bombers could take off, strike a target 800 kilometers away, and return home for lunch? The economic inefficiency of these giants became undeniable. They were battleships on land rendered obsolete by aircraft carriers in the sky. Moreover, the technology born within these guns eventually outgrew them. The ballistic calculations used for the Paris gun directly influenced the development of the V2 missile. The engineers who learned to stabilize projectiles in the stratosphere did not continue building cannons, they began building rockets. In a strange twist of fate, the DNA of these terrifying guns lives on not in modern artillery, but in the space launch vehicles that carried humanity to the moon. The desire to reach farther and hit harder evolved from gunpowder's brute strength to the precision of rocket fuel. The steel dinosaurs did not simply die, they evolved into aluminum and titanium raptors, leaving behind their heavy steel shells in the mud of history. Today, when we look at photographs of Big Bertha or the twisted wreckage of Gustav, we are filled with a complex mixture of emotions. We feel horror at the destruction they caused, but also an undeniable awe at the engineering prowess required to bring them to life. They stand as monuments to an age when humanity pushed the limits of machinery to their absolute breaking point. They remind us that there is always a limit to how far we can scale things before the laws of physics push back. These machines were the ultimate expression of the Industrial Revolution applied to warfare. Heavy, loud, dirty, and magnificent in their own terrifying way. They were the final roar of the Steel Age before the quiet digital precision of the Silicon Age took over. So as we close the book on these mechanical leviathans, I want to leave you with a question to ponder. Every era has its own dinosaurs. Technologies that are massive, expensive, and seemingly invincible right up until the moment they become obsolete. In our modern world of hypersonic missiles and swarms of drones, what do you think is today's Schwerer? Gustav, could it be the billion-dollar aircraft carriers or the main battle tank? Which present-day king of the battlefield will be viewed 100 years from now as a slow, clumsy giant marching toward extinction? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey through the history of heavy metal and want more deep dive analyses of world-changing technologies, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We have many more stories to tell from the depths of the ocean to the edge of the universe. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep looking toward the horizon, but don't forget to watch the skies.